little epistle of James, chapter 4, and I shall read verse 17. This is the last verse of the chapter. Anyone who knows the good he ought to do and doesn't do it, he sins. Most of us have formulated a list of some wrongful deeds, like don't steal, don't lie, don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't watch X-rated movies, don't get drunk, etc. And we believe that as long as we don't do these abhorrent things, then we'll be all right. We're of course aware of the fact that there are varieties of sin. There are sins of moral failure. There are sins of disposition, like the attitude of anger and hostility. There are ethical sins of conduct, like cheating. There are social sins, like bigotry, prejudice, and discrimination. And we also have spiritual sins, like pride and selfishness. But if you study the New Testament in its entirety, you'll find that the greatest sin is the sin of omission. Today's verse is a conclusion of a paragraph which starts with verse 13, where we are introduced to a boastful businessman, a wheeler dealer, who lays plans for an entire year. He takes out his calendar and marks a date. He takes out his map and draws a circle around the name of a certain city. And after completing his marketing research, he says to himself, on a certain date, I'll go to a city, stay there a year or two, buy and sell certain commodities, and earn a huge profit. Where did this shrewd businessman go wrong? What did he do that was wrong? God is not opposed to advanced planning. God is not opposed to thoughtfulness. God is not against conducting a business. God is not against making a reasonable profit. So what did the shrewd businessman do wrong? If you read the passage, James chapter 4, verses 13 through 17, you will find that there is no mention of God. There is no mention of prayer. This fellow was guilty of the sin of omission. He did not seek God's will through the avenue of prayer. That was his sin. That's where he went wrong. He was guilty of the sin of omission. He lived as if God did not exist, or if he existed, he did not matter. One day, while Jesus was traveling throughout the land of Palestine, he came across a fig tree. Its branches were covered with green leaves, but it bore no fruit. It was completely barren. There was no reason for that fig tree to be fruitless. So Jesus pronounced a curse on that fig tree, and it immediately withered and died. The only thing Jesus put a curse on throughout his ministry in this word was on a fig tree that was fruitless. When we read in the Gospels that Jesus cursed a fig tree, it doesn't mean that he used foul language. He only said, "May you wither and die because you are barren." Now, most Bible commentators believe that the fig tree was a symbol of the nation of Israel. God had emancipated the Israelites from Egyptian bondage. He had provided for all their needs during their wanderings in the Sinai desert. He led them to the promised land, a land that was flowing with milk and honey, a prosperous land. He helped them establish a kingdom. He entered into a covenant relationship with them. He sent them prophets to guide them. And God's intention was that the nation of Israel be a light to the Gentile world. But in that mission they failed. So it's proper to say that that barren fig tree was a symbol of the nation of Israel, that they failed to produce the desired fruit that God expected from them. In the parable of the talents, in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 25, we read about a rich landowner who wanted to go on a business trip, but prior to his departure, he gave to his servants different amounts of money. The first two servants invested their master's money and generated a respectable profit. But the third servant buried his talent in the ground. The master, upon his return, praised the two servants who had invested their money wisely and had made a profit. But he condemned the third servant because he had done nothing. He was guilty of the sin of omission. Notice the third servant did not waste his master's money. He did not squander it. He did not steal his master's money. He was guilty of the sin of omission. He did nothing with what his master had given him. And in the gospel, Jesus denounces this third servant and calls him a wicked and slothful servant. He was wicked and slothful. Laziness is a sin, by the way. In the story of the Good Samaritan, we read that while a man was traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho, he was robbed and severely injured by thieves. He was left bleeding to death at the curbside. Then we're told that a priest and a Levite was an assistant priest. So you can say two people of the cloth, a priest and his assistant, saw this injured man who was bleeding. They knew he needed immediate help. But the Bible says they passed him by. They passed him by means they completely ignored him. So they were guilty of the sin of omission. They did nothing to help that injured man. In contrast to the priest and the Levite, a Samaritan came along and he saw this injured man. He had compassion on him. He wanted to help him in every way he could. He stopped his bleeding, put him on his donkey, took him to a clinic, and paid for his medical treatments. He did what the priest and the Levite had failed to do. So you see, the sin of omission is a serious sin. Many will go to hell not only for what they have done, but also for what they have chosen not to do. A teacher asked a 5th grade student to spell the word vacuum. And the student responded by saying, "I'm not sure I can spell the word vacuum, but I've got it in my head." There's no vacuum in our head because we're always thinking about something. Now, how do we keep wrong thoughts from occupying our mind? In Philippians chapter 4, verse 8, the Apostle Paul gives us a mental exercise. He says, "Whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are just and pure and honest and lovely and of good report, think on these things." In other words, he is introducing the law of substitution. Substitute a good thought for every bad one. If you've ever planted a garden, you know that weeds would pop up out of nowhere. And if you don't uproot those weeds from time to time, they will take over the whole garden and choke up your beautiful plants. The same thing we ought to do with our thoughts. We have to uproot from our minds evil thoughts. Take out the weeds, otherwise they'll dominate our life. We all know about the moral failure of King David. But have you ever stopped and asked yourself, what led him to get into trouble? What was the reason that he committed those sins? Well, in 2 Samuel chapter 11, verses 1 and 2, we find the answer. There in 2 Samuel chapter 11, the first 2 verses were told that when the armies of Israel went out to do battle against the Ammonites, King David chose to stay in Jerusalem. And he let Joab, one of his trusted friends, to command the armies. Now the Ammonites' land was what they call Jordan. The capital of Jordan is called Amman. Amman is a corruption of Ammon. So the Ammonites lived east of the Jordan River. And that country now is called Jordan. Actually, Jordan occupies 3 ancient lands. The land of Moab, the land of the Ammonites, and the land of the Edomites. They are all found in modern Jordan. And these 3 nations, of course, were enemies of Israel, and they always had skirmishes and battles. Well, David was the king. He was the commander-in-chief of the army. It was his duty to join the army whenever they went into battle. But he chose to stay in Jerusalem and enjoy the ease and comfort that his palace provided. So he neglected his duty. It was his duty to be with the army. He was supposed to lead out the charge against the Ammonites, not Joab. And then we're told in the same chapter that towards the evening, King David went to the roof of his palace. The roofs in the Middle East, house roofs were flat. They're still flat. Most houses have flat roofs. So he was, while walking on the roof of his palace in the cool of the evening, he saw a lady who was bathing, and she was a smashing beauty. He desired to have her. And that led him to commit a crime. He had that woman's husband killed so that he could have her. So King David committed the sin of omission by neglecting his duty. Had he gone out with his army to do battle against the Ammonites, he wouldn't have fallen into this grievous sin. He wouldn't have committed this heinous crime. So we have to be careful not to neglect the performance of our duties. As human beings, we have duties. As citizens of this country, we have certain duties. As Christians, we have certain duties. So we have to be careful not to avoid the performance of our duties, because the sin of omission is as destructive and as grievous in God's sight as the sin of commission.